I looked at ESPN, Sleeper, Yahoo, and Underdog Drafts, combined all their ADPs into a master ADP list, and I was very shocked to see where certain wide receivers were getting drafted. I have 3 landmines and 3 guys that you can just take later on if you wanted to avoid the overdrafted guys, specifically at the wide receiver position, starting off with DK Metcalf versus Xavier Worthy. So right now, if you're drafting on ESPN, you'll actually see Worthy goes ahead of Metcalf by about 4 picks, which in my opinion should be the right call. However, if you're on Sleeper, you have Metcalf going ahead of Worthy by 7 picks. If you're in Yahoo drafts, you have Metcalf going ahead of Worthy by 2 rounds. So this averages out to DK Metcalf with a master ADP of 48.6, Xavier Worthy at 53.5. And let me tell you exactly why this is bad. But first, I do want to mention that this master ADP list is completely free for you over there on flockfantasy.com. Just go to the recent post tab and you'll see that I made a post there on July 23rd, and I'm going to keep this updated every single week for you going into the future. That way you can use it for your draft. But going over and looking at the base expectations that we should have for these offenses going into this next year, while I understand that, yes, Patrick Mahomes has been a much lower volume passer over the past 2 seasons, and at the same time, the Chiefs just simply have not scored as many points in 2023 and 2024 in comparison to what we were used to in 2018 through 2022. However, sportsbooks are projecting the Kansas City Chiefs to average about 24.1 points scored per game, which would mark them as a top 5 offense in the NFL. And they're projecting the Pittsburgh Steelers to only average 20.4 points per game, which would be close to a bottom 5 offense in the league this year in projections. So the starting point that we should have is, yes, the Kansas City Chiefs and Patrick Mahomes will have a much better offense than the 40-year-old Aaron Rodgers-led Pittsburgh Steelers. Shouldn't be a hot take. This shouldn't be a surprise to anybody. It should be obvious. Second thing that I want to address is DK Metcalf this past year did have the worst season of his NFL career by a bunch of different marks. So you can just pull up these stats on flockfantasy.com whenever you want, but you'll see that Metcalf averaged only 12.75 points per game, and he actually had his lowest career mark ever with his yards per route run down at 1.82, and his previous career low was back in 2022 at 1.93. Obviously, the Pittsburgh Steelers give DK Metcalf a massive contract this offseason, indicating that they still believe that DK Metcalf is the top-end talent that he once was. But I do want to just evaluate, what was DK Metcalf's ultimate ceiling over the past 7 years, 6 years? I mean, he was drafted in 2019, so you do have a 6-year sample at this point going into year 7. His best ceiling ever was the wide receiver 8 in 2020, where he finishes with 16.96 fantasy points per game. But outside of that 1 year, the highest mark that he had ever finished was the wide receiver 20 with about 14.09 points per game. So throughout his entire NFL career, DK Metcalf's been a low-end wide receiver 2. We have 1 season of him being a low-end wide receiver 1 and 1 season of him being a low-end wide receiver 3. If we look at Xavier Worthy, yes, if we are taking into account the entirety of his rookie year, he only averaged 11.01 fantasy points per game, but I think that's very unfair to do considering the fact that the starters didn't really play in week 18, and at the same time with rookie seasons, we're going to expect players to get better over time. So what we can actually do is we can head over to the player comparison tool on flockfantasy.com. This is also completely free for you on the site, and you can see that if we take out the time period for Xavier Worthy in week 18, as well as the beginning portion of the season, and we look at the final 8 weeks that he played in his rookie year, he actually averages 13.9 fantasy points per game. That is a much better mark. And if we actually look at DK Metcalf, not just this past season where he had his worst year of his career, but averaging over the past 2 years, you'll see DK Metcalf down at 13.4 fantasy points per contest. Now, of course, just because we make the little gimmicky time frames have Xavier Worthy scoring more points than DK Metcalf doesn't mean that that's exactly how you should draft them going forward. But what we can also do is we can look at the new range of outcomes tool that's also completely free on flockfantasy.com, and we can look at Xavier Worthy's comps since the year 2008 for the closest rookie season comparables that we have. And if we are looking at Xavier Worthy's closest rookie season comparables, you have Tyreek Hill, Jackson Smith-Njigba, Darnell Mooney, Jamison Crowder, Hollywood Brown, Wan'Dale Robinson, Tyler Boyd, and then a couple wide receivers that did it in 2024, which we don't have data points on their second seasons, so we're not really going to include them for the purpose of this research. But what's very important to note is how many of these wide receivers improved from year 1 to year 2, which obviously should be the natural progression for a wide receiver to get better in their second season. Tyreek Hill jumps from 12.4 fantasy points per game up to about 16. JSN jumps from 8.8 fantasy points per game up to about 15. Darnell Mooney, 9.5 to about 13. Jamison Crowder, 8.3 to about 12. Hollywood Brown, 10.4 to 11.4. Wan'Dale moved up just slightly, and Tyler Boyd got slightly worse. So realistically, we are looking at a sample of about 7-8 wide receivers, and every single one of them, besides Tyler Boyd, managed to improve from year 1 to year 2. So we can combine this with the end of season progress that Xavier Worthy showed at the end of last year, and we can very comfortably say that Xavier Worthy projects to be an offense that will get better this next season. He's already showed that he's on an upward trajectory. He has the round 1 NFL draft capital and all the athleticism to go along with it. We can look at the historical data and say, hell, most wide receivers that have this similar profile did improve from year 1 to year 2. So it's a very safe assumption by all the numbers that Worthy should have a much better second season than his first year. Now, if we go ahead and look at DK Metcalf's similar seasons at age 26 years old to every wide receiver since the year 2008, you have some very good wide receivers here. You have AJ Green with a similar season in 2017, Tyler Lockett, Odell Beckham Jr., Terry McLaurin, Pierre Garçon, Mike Wallace, Emmanuel Sanders, Christian Kirk, and then Juwan Jennings. Now with Juwan Jennings, he did it this past year, so we don't have that data point for him this next season. But it's not a guarantee that Metcalf's going to get better from age 26 to age 27. AJ Green managed to get better. Tyler Lockett managed to get better. Actually, you don't have anybody else. You have Odell Beckham Jr. staying about the same. Terry McLaurin getting slightly worse. Pierre Garçon getting slightly worse. Mike Wallace getting slightly worse. Emmanuel Sanders getting much worse. And Christian Kirk getting much worse as well. So if we're looking at Metcalf over the past 2 years versus Worthy when he established himself as a full-time starter, Worthy was better as a full-time starter, and Worthy's on the upwards trajectory, where DK Metcalf, you can't guarantee that same thing for. So I would rather have Worthy straight up over DK Metcalf this next season. If you're drafting in underdog drafts, to be completely honest with you, that ADP is going to be a little bit more up to date, which is why I actually included it with the ADP master cheat sheet, just because I think it's going to make a better master list anyway. So you're not going to get that type of value. DK Metcalf's actually going at the 4 or 5 turn, where Xavier Worthy's already gotten pushed up to the beginning of round 4. But with underdog drafts, I actually have a very exciting announcement. At the very beginning of August, they are going to go back to dropping the flock tournaments 3 times a week. We'll be streaming them every single night in the live stream, and I am super excited to draft with you. Of course, if you want to get in those flock tournaments, or if you want to take a shot at Best Ball Mania with $2 million up top, you can find a link to Underdog Fantasy in both the description and the comment section. It's best ball, so there's no time commitment at all during the season. So I draft hundreds of teams every year. That's how we won a decent amount of money there back in the day. But if you use promo code FLOCK when you sign up, you'll get a 50% deposit bonus up to $1,000. And on top of that, you'll get all my 2025 fantasy football rankings and our draft guide cheat sheet, which will officially drop on August 1st. And made your first deposit in 2025, you should expect that going straight to your email. But going over to our next picks that are wrong in both sleeper as well as Yahoo drafts, you have Chris Olave versus Calvin Ridley. Chris Olave at the moment is going at pick 62 in sleeper drafts, where you can get Calvin Ridley almost 2 rounds later at pick 78. And Chris Olave is going at 67 in Yahoo drafts in comparison to Calvin Ridley at 71. Now, I do think ESPN has this correct for what it's worth, but we'll have a very poorly mispriced wide receiver on ESPN at the end of this video. But going over and doing that same exercise with Calvin Ridley versus Chris Olave this next year, first thing I want to reference is the offensive environment that both wide receivers should be playing in. Now, you have a 19.5 point per game projection from sportsbooks for the Tennessee Titans this season, with an 18.4 point projection for the New Orleans Saints, which would put them as the second worst offense in the NFL this season. And realistically, if we go back and look at sportsbook projections last year, what we can see is the teams that surprised most to the upside were the teams that hit on rookie quarterbacks, such such as Jaden Daniels and Bo Nix. Denver and Washington both really surprised to the upside. And with that in mind, we have to ask ourselves, could the Tennessee Titans do the same thing with Cam Ward? And personally, I have a lot more faith in Cam Ward than I would in Tyler Shuck for this next year. And same thing with DK Metcalf versus Xavier Worthy. I can't just compare the 2024 season for Calvin Ridley and Chris Olave, because that 2024 year was such an outlier for Chris Olave. It was by far and away the worst season of his NFL career at only 9.6 fantasy points per game, which would make him the wide receiver 55. Now, I will say the efficiency for Olave was still amazing. I mean, Olave had 3.02 yards per route run, which would have actually marked him as the 10th best wide receiver in that category this past year. But we can take a step back and we can go back and see Chris Olave was the wide receiver 17 in points per game in 2023. And he actually did this with slightly fewer snaps. He only played 59% of the snaps from a per game perspective in 2023 for the New Orleans Saints. But what I wanted to do to maybe average this out for both wide receivers, because Calvin Ridley also had the worst year of his NFL career this past season with the Tennessee Titans, is I wanted to look at the past 2 years' numbers for Calvin Ridley and Chris Olave. So with the player comparison tool on flogfantasy.com, we changed the time frame for both players to 2023 and 2024, and we'll see that both wide receivers are very comparable. You have Calvin Ridley with 12.6 fantasy points per game, and we have Chris Olave with 12.8. Now, full transparency, I think Olave is a much more talented wide receiver. Olave did this at a much younger age. We can see the true talent by Chris Olave by going with the range of outcomes tool to find similar seasons to Chris Olave in his last healthy year. I don't want to look at Chris Olave, say, in 2024, just because realistically that season was derailed by injuries, and I almost want to say that it's close to meaningless. So what we decided to do is we decided to go to the range of outcomes tool and put in Chris Olave's age 22 season to see the wide receivers that he was closest to. And there you have CeeDee Lamb, Marquise Colston, Kenny Golladay, Brandon Marshall, Stephon Diggs, DJ Chark, Jeremy Maclin, and Martavis Bryant. And most of these wide receivers the following year averaged anywhere from 14.5 to 17.5 fantasy points per game, which would have been an improvement from where Olave was at 22. But obviously his season gets derailed by injuries and he falls down dramatically. Now, looking at Calvin Ridley, I think we can actually probably use Ridley's 2024 season and do it comfortably. What I wanted to do is I wanted to look at all wide receivers that went from their 7th year in their NFL career to their 8th year and see typically what happens. Should you expect a wide receiver to get worse at this point? The closest comps were Chris Godwin, Mike Evans, Marvin Jones, Cooper Kupp, Amari Cooper, Devontae Parker, Noah Brown, and then you had Courtland Sutton, DJ Moore posting similar seasons to Calvin Ridley this past year. But realistically, I didn't want to use these guys because we don't have their 2025 years just yet. But what we can actually see in the case of Calvin Ridley is only Devontae Parker and Noah Brown got worse from their 7th NFL season to their 8th NFL season. So Ridley's not at the point of his NFL career yet where we should expect some natural fall off and we should expect Ridley is just worse given his age. No, I mean, Ridley's still very much in the prime of his career. So just looking at these two receivers, I think that they're both very talented. I think both of their seasons last year were derailed for different reasons. Calvin Ridley had arguably some of the worst quarterback play in the entire NFL, and his offense was arguably the worst offense in the league. Chris Olave, on the other hand, obviously just got derailed due to injuries. But now if we ask how their situations are going to change going into this next season and which one we should expect a potential bounce back from, I am a lot more confident with the Tennessee Titans offense with Cam Ward than I would be with the New Orleans Saints offense with Tyler Shuck. Not to mention that obviously Olave has the concussion issues where you're not going to deal with that same thing for Calvin Ridley. Now, the worst ADP that I found with all these wide receivers was the actual Josh Downs ADP, specifically on ESPN. Josh Downs goes at a pick 140 on ESPN in comparison to 104 on Sleeper, 99 on Yahoo, 83 on Underdog. And actually, if you're looking at flockfantasy.com, the expert average rank of Josh Downs is pick 66, which is just crazy to see that ESPN drafts could be this wildly off, which is why we made this master ADP list, and which is also why over on flockfantasy.com, we actually put out public mock draft lobbies that you can go in and you can draft against other people in real time. And hopefully you're not going up against other 12-year-olds that just found ESPN at the top of their Google search. So if you ever wanted to get in a public mock draft lobby, just go to the mock draft page on the site and you can enter in a PPR, non-PPR, half PPR mock draft for completely free. You'll probably see Josh Downs go a lot earlier, but this gives you an opportunity if you're in your ESPN draft to aggressively target Josh Downs late, where I would rather have him over Cooper Kupp, but Cooper Kupp is going 60 picks earlier. That means 5 rounds earlier. Now, obviously, if we look at this past year, Cooper Kupp, much better season than Josh Downs from a points per game perspective. You had Kupp at 14.6, Downs down at 13.1. You have Cooper Kupp playing more snaps, drawing more targets, more receptions per game, more receiving yards per game, more receiving touchdowns per game, and running more routes per game. Now, if you actually look at the efficiency of these wide receivers, this is where things get interesting. Josh Downs had a 26.1% team target share, which marks 17th in the NFL. This is despite only playing 65% of the snaps for the Indianapolis Colts, which marks 76th in the NFL. So he wasn't running many routes. He wasn't out on the field, but when he was drawing targets at a very high rate. We can go through and look at his yards per route run, which was 2.3, despite this being a garbage offense. He actually had a higher mark yards per target than Cooper Kupp, where Cooper Kupp was 120th among wide receivers in the NFL last season in yards per target. We can go over and look at the range of outcome stuff as well and look at Josh Downs in comparison to other wide receivers in year 2 that posted similar seasons, because we all know a year 3 breakout is something that we are all trying to find. And Josh Downs' second year compares to Deebo Samuel's, Keenan Allen, Drake London, Michael Pittman Jr., C. Anderson, Christian Kirk, Darnell Mooney, and Chase Claypool. Now, yes, some of these wide receivers got worse from year 2 to year 3. C. Anderson got slightly worse, Kirk got slightly worse, Darnell Mooney got much worse, and Chase Claypool got much worse. Hopefully Josh Downs isn't Chase Claypool, right? But realistically, we found massive breakouts. You found league-winning players. Deebo Samuel jumps from 11.1 fantasy points per game up to 21. Keenan Allen jumps from 12 fantasy points per game up to 20. Drake London jumps from about 11 fantasy points per game up to 16.5. Now, if we look at Cooper Kupp in his age 30 season and look at historical trends here, to nobody's surprise, typically wide receivers are going to get worse from age 30 to age 31. Now, his closest comps include a lot of players that played in 2024, so we don't have data points on Stephon Diggs, Tyreek Hill, Mike Evans, Julian Edelman just yet, but we can see that he comped to like Devontae Adams, Adam Thielen, Emmanuel Sanders, Tyler Lockett, and AJ Green. And every wide receiver on this list got worse in their age 31 season outside of Devontae Adams. So just looking at the natural trajectory of these wide receivers, Josh Downs, we should expect at this point of his career to continue to ascend with a potential explosion in year 3, as opposed to Cooper Kupp, unless he's Devontae Adams and he sees a quarterback upgrade, we should expect him to get worse. And for me, I am personally expecting that the transition from Stafford to Darnold is a downgrade. So I don't really see much of an argument to be made for Cooper Kupp to go 5 rounds ahead of Josh Downs. Like, realistically, in underdog drafts, people know what they're doing. Cooper Kupp goes behind Josh Downs by a decent little mark. The one thing that I do want to point out, just to be fair, because we did it with the other comparisons, is sportsbooks are projecting the Seattle Seahawks to average 22.5 points per game this year in comparison to Indianapolis at 20.5. So the Colts should be a worse offense than Seattle. You're hoping Daniel Jones is the starter for Josh Downs. If we are trying to maybe make another bullish stance with Downs, we can say that JSN more likely than not is going to be the wide receiver 1 in Seattle, where Josh Downs has a very high probability of leapfrogging Michael Pittman Jr. in the target totem pole. But I think that's all I got for you. I really hope that we were able to help you out with this video. Again, everything we showed in this video is completely free on flogfantasy.com for you. I'm trying to provide as much value as I possibly can. That includes the master ADP list that is free and can be found on the recent post tab. That includes the range of outcomes tool. That includes the player comparison tool. That includes all the stats on the rankings page. So really hope you can take advantage of all that free stuff we're putting out for you. We're working our butts off to try to make sure that you can win your league this year. But I really appreciate you. Really hope I can draft with you in an underdog draft tonight, especially if we can hop in some flock tournaments together. And if you wanted to draft with us on Underdog, you can find that link in the description and the comment section. Promo code FLOCK will get you a 50% deposit bonus up to $1,000. Plus, it will get you all our 2025 fantasy football rankings, draft guide cheat sheets for completely free. But appreciate you and really hope we get to see you out with the live stream later tonight.